A justice's book lies open on a desk in Arizona territory. That's where I want to begin. Not with the blanket, not with the wagon, not even with the ranch fence outside Tombstone. With the book. Back in the early 1880s, between Tombstone, Benson, and Tucson, a single page could do real work. It could move freight, settle an account, file a complaint, issue a warrant, record a marriage, or damage somebody before she had time to answer back. Out there, horses still mattered. So did roads, water, weather, and the long distance between one office and the next. But paper often moved faster than any person trapped inside it. That's why this story holds on. As it comes to me, a rancher outside Tombstone finds a young woman left at his fence under a white blanket, bruised and bound, with a note that treats her less like a person than a delivery. He didn't order her, he didn't pay for her, and yet somehow his name is tied to the paperwork. The story gives us names: Caleb Thorne, Eliza, Silas Crow, and then it drives toward a desperate solution. Get the woman to a justice, marry her quickly, use one piece of paper to stop the men who mean to take her back. It's a powerful story, maybe a little too powerful. So here's the question that has to guide everything that follows. What, if anything, in that story can actually be proved? And what does the surviving record tell us about the kind of world that made a story like this believable in the first place? The first answer is the simple one. What I have here is not a case file. It's a dramatized narrative. It comes with scenes, motives, confrontations, and spoken lines, but without a cited marriage entry, freight receipt, court docket, sheriff return, a newspaper notice to hold it in place. So I can't honestly present Caleb Thorne, Eliza, and Silas Crow as established historical figures just on the strength of this telling. If those names are real, they still need records behind them. If they're altered, combined, or invented, that matters too. But that doesn't make the story useless. It just changes the work. Instead of retelling it as settled fact, I have to ask a different question. If something like this really happened in territorial Arizona, where would it leave a mark? Which rooms would it pass through? Which offices? Which routes? Which pages? That takes us first to the map, because Arizona Territory in the early 1880s was not just some blurry thing called the frontier. It was a chain of places, each with its own function and its own kind of power. Tombstone was booming. Money, labor, vice, speculation, lawsuits, freight, merchants, teamsters, clerks, and a whole lot of people trying to turn a fast, unstable town into something permanent. Benson mattered because it tied Tombstone into a larger freight and rail network. Tucson was older, more established, and heavier with administration. If trouble began outside Tombstone and then ran through Benson and Tucson, that part makes sense immediately. Goods moved there, messages moved there, so did accusations. They just didn't all move at the same speed. A rider leaving a ranch at first light could still lose a race to a telegram filed by somebody with money, access, and a better position in town. That's one reason this story feels plausible, even before it becomes provable. Structurally, it gets something right. In the territorial West, distance didn't weigh on everybody the same way. A poor person on the road felt distance in the horse, the throat, the canteen, the hours, and the next water source. A better connected person could hand the work off to a telegraph operator. And that matters because the most serious claim in this story is not really the blanket, it's the paperwork. A woman is supposedly treated as paid and delivered, a line item is altered, a complaint is waiting ahead of the people it targets. Put it that way, and the whole thing stops being a rescue melodrama and becomes something much more Western and much uglier. Who gets written down first? Who gets believed first? The injured woman? The man's name appears in an account? The local operator who can lean on a clerk? The deputy with a message in his pocket? Before I let that go too far, I need to narrow one point. Could a woman in Arizona territory literally be entered into a freight system exactly like a crate of goods? On the material I have, I can't prove that exact mechanism, and I'd be careful with it. The language in the story is theatrical. Real coercion in the West was often less neat on paper and no less brutal because of it. Women could be trapped by debt, by prostitution networks, by work arrangements that blurred into confinement, by travel they didn't choose, by control inside boarding houses, by men claiming authority over them, and by the simple fact that a woman who was injured, poor, alone, and far from support could be defined by somebody else before she could define herself. A clerk didn't need to write human cargo in a ledger for the system to function that way in practice. And this is where race and class stop being background and become central. The story as it's supplied leaves the woman's identity strangely blank. Historically, that's a problem. In Arizona territory, whether she was Anglo, Mexican, indigenous, black, Chinese, immigrant, mixed heritage, poor, locally known, newly arrived, respectable by local standards, or already marked by rumor, could change almost everything. It could shape how a clerk described her, whether a justice listened, how a newspaper framed her, whether townspeople stepped in, and whether any man's claim over her sounded plausible to official ears. A modern story can float a young woman through the plot and leave it at that. A real woman in the territorial Southwest didn't have that luxury. That omission makes me suspicious of how neat the tale is, but it also tells me something useful. Stories like this often survive in stripped-down form because later tellers want moral clarity. One helpless woman, one upright rancher, one smooth villain, one crooked badge. The actual West usually worked in layers. A freight clerk mattered, a boarding house keeper mattered, a justice mattered, a deputy mattered, a witness mattered. Those people don't make for a tidy legend, which is exactly why they tend to disappear from one. So let's move into one of the rooms this story gives us clearly enough to trust as a setting, even if not as a documented scene. The freight office. That room matters. Freight in southern Arizona was not an abstraction. Somebody handled manifests. Somebody took payment. Somebody checked accounts. Somebody received goods coming off rail connections and saw them forwarded on. Somebody kept the books. In a boom region where money moved fast and accountability often arrived later, mistakes happened, shortcuts happened, and fraudulent use of paperwork was entirely possible. A man with an existing account at a yard or mercantile could find his name attached to something he never expected, especially if the goal was concealment or leverage, not clean bookkeeping. That still doesn't get us to a routine practice of listing a woman as freight, but it gets us closer to a careful conclusion. The story may be exaggerating a real dynamic. Instead of a public line reading "woman," what may be remembered here is the way local men converted a vulnerable person into debt, transfer, obligation, or possession. In plain speech, they may have treated her like cargo, and the story later made that metaphor literal because it sharpened the outrage. From there, the route narrows again, out of the freight room and into a justice's office. This is where the tale makes its boldest practical claim. A quick marriage, it says, could make the woman legally untouchable. That's too strong. A marriage certificate in territorial Arizona was not magic. It could alter legal standing. It could complicate a rival claim. It could make an officer hesitate. It could give a woman a recognized household tie where before she had none.
But marriage in the 19th century West was not liberation in any modern sense. It placed a woman inside another legal and social structure dominated by a husband. The law might stop one man from claiming her, only to place her more firmly under another man's name. That doesn't make the marriage idea absurd. It makes it grimly plausible. If a woman was in immediate danger, if public reputation mattered, if a justice was willing to act, and if a man with steadier local standing was prepared to put his own name on the line, then marriage could serve as emergency cover. Not equality, not complete safety. Cover, time, a procedural obstacle, a way to force the next fight into daylight and onto the record. And in a world where the alternative might be confinement, disappearance, or being redefined by somebody else's complaint, even that limited shield could.
A telegraph counter may look less dramatic than a showdown in the street, but in this story, it is the more dangerous place. The story says that by the time the couple reaches Tucson, a complaint is already waiting for them. I can't verify that exact scene, but the mechanism behind it is completely believable. A territorial officer didn't have to be part of some grand criminal conspiracy to become dangerous. He only needed a message, a bias, and enough confidence to treat one version of events as official before hearing another. Hold the rancher is exactly the kind of instruction that could do real damage, even if the case later fell apart. Arrest first, sort it out later, separate him from her, control the room. Once that happens, the balance of power changes very quickly. That is why I push back against the old idea that the West was simply lawless. Arizona Territory had law everywhere. It had stamps, dockets, marriage books, tax rolls, mining claims, probate fights, jails, constables, district courts, and justices trying to turn disorder into paper. The problem wasn't the absence of law. The problem was that law moved through unequal institutions. Some people could activate it faster than others. Some were assumed to be credible before they even spoke. Others were not. Cash mattered. Race mattered. Language mattered. Local standing mattered. And so did the ability to get your version of events onto a page before somebody else could. At that point, the story circles back to its names, and that is where the ground starts to thin out again. As the story is presented, Caleb Thorne, Eliza, and Silas Crow are not anchored by a cited paper trail. I do not have a marriage book entry, a district court filing, a sheriff's record, or a newspaper item that ties these names to this exact event. And that means I cannot honestly reconstruct their dialogue, their final choices, or the precise sequence of events that would turn this into a clean showdown between truth and a badge. The red scarf, the blanket, the note, the collector at the fence, the public turn in Tucson, the final decision to remain at the ranch, any of that may preserve an old memory. It may also be later embroidery or frontier fiction built out of recognizable parts. But if you strip away the embroidery, something solid still remains. A woman in territorial Arizona could absolutely be made dangerously vulnerable by transport, debt, isolation, and reputation. A man with steadier local standing could absolutely become entangled in that situation through paperwork, whether he wanted to or not. A justice's office could absolutely become a place where status was remade in a hurry. A telegram could absolutely outrun a rider. A deputy could absolutely arrive carrying an official version of events that served the wrong people. And daylight, a courthouse, a street,
Witnesses, a public question asked in front of others, could absolutely restrain behavior that worked much better in a back room or on a lonely road. That part matters. Even if the Tucson street scene cannot be proven exactly as told, its logic is sound. Private coercion thrives in isolation. Public procedure can fail, too, of course, but it forces people to speak plainly, sign their names, answer questions, and risk contradiction. In the territorial West, that was sometimes the only opening a vulnerable person had. So what can the record really let me say without pushing beyond what it can bear? I cannot confirm this story as a documented incident in the form we have it now. I cannot present the named characters as established historical figures on the evidence currently in hand. I cannot tell you that a woman was literally entered into a freight ledger near Tombstone and then saved by an emergency marriage in Tucson, because I do not have the proof for that exact case. What I can say is that this story is built out of real territorial mechanics. It understands that the West ran more than grit, fear, and gun belts. It ran on account books, route maps, office hours, telegraph lines, witnesses, seals, and local stand-in. It understands that a person could be endangered by paperwork and then forced to seek shelter in more paperwork. And it understands that the most important contest was often not between two armed men, but between two versions of the same person written into the record. I think that is the real reason the story lasts, not because the blanket is cinematic, because the page is. If a marriage entry ever turns up, or a complaint, or some local notice that ties these names to a real territorial case, then the story may narrow in to something firmer. Until then, the honest answer has to remain divided. The dramatic scene is still unproven, but the world that could have produced it is very real. And to me, that matters more than a clean legend ever could. Legends usually want a simple arrangement: one good man, one bad man, and one innocent person passed between them. But the surviving record, when it survives at all, shows something harder than that. Clerks matter, routes matter, delays matter, law matters, and so do class, race, and the standing to make one version of events look official. A woman could be in danger long before anyone physically laid a hand on her, simply because the room she entered, the road she traveled, and the paper filed ahead of her were already tilted against her. That is why I come back in the end to two kinds of ink. One kind reduces a person to an item, a debt, a transfer, a claim. The other tries to restore a legal identity before the first kind closes over her completely. Somewhere between Tombstone and Tucson, in the world this story comes out of, that may have been the whole fight. And if I had to leave you with one final image, it would not be a gun, it would not be a horse, it would not be a showdown in the street. It would be a justice's book in the Arizona Eat, open flat on a desk, waiting for a name to be written before somebody else writes a different one first.